This is immigration and citizenship attorney Parviz Malakouti. And today we are having our 13th space. This is Mobility Spaces dealing with dual citizenship, freedom of movement, and sovereignty issues. And today's topic is going to be changing name and legal identity in a state of second citizenship. So second citizenship, third citizenship, fourth citizenship. And so we want to have just an open discussion on what it looks like to change your name, when it's advisable, when it might not be advisable, what some of the common methods are for name change. And then, of course, probably the most important part, what are the issues that can arise from trying to change a person's name? Because, if you naturalize in a second country, ostensibly, hopefully you have a few more decades left of your life. And obviously, those name changes can have downstream effects. So today, so far we got David. Thank you, David. We got Mr. Italian Stallion, and of course we have Patrick here. Okay, and so I'll just start by going over just a few basics about kind of name changes, especially when naturalizing in a foreign country, as well as what I see as some of the issues, and then we'll start discussing. So first of all, typically, there's typically a few main ways where people change names in general. So naturalizing in a foreign country, some countries allow people to change their names in the actual application. They write into the application and then they get a certificate of naturalization with the new name. And typically, I'm speaking generally here, but typically that certificate of naturalization can then be used to obtain new sets of documents, right? So formal documents. So that's number one, naturalization. Of course, number two, through marriage, right? In some jurisdictions, you can change your name through marriage. Third is by court order, right? So petitioning to the court to actually change your name. And then fourth, probably the least known method, or let's say the least known, big method of changing your name, but also probably the most commonly used throughout history, is name change through what's called the common usage method. At least we call that in the United States, or common law name change. And that's basically changing your name by just adopting a new name and using it in your everyday life over a long period of time. That is recognized in English common law as having legal validity and effect as a name change, as well as in a number of U.S. states. I'd have to check, but I think it's actually the majority of U.S. states. They recognize the legality of a name change just by common usage over a long period of time. Now, that doesn't mean that a person's going to not have difficulty in getting new sets of documents, right? Just by proving that they have been using a certain name through a long period of time. That issues can still arise from that, obviously, but the common usage remains a method of name change regardless. For me as a mobility and citizenship practitioner, this issue professionally comes up most often when people are either naturalizing in a new country, okay, and I'm helping them with that, and they want to know, whether they're curious about whether they should change their name, they want to know whether they should do it. And the second scenario in which this arises for me as a practitioner is when I'm helping somebody to apply for naturalization or to verify a second citizenship, and we have to deal with name changes to prove the case, either a name change by the applicant themselves, or sometimes, especially in citizenship by descent cases, having to prove a name change for an ancestor through which the applicant is qualifying, right? And this can be a big problem in citizenship by descent cases, right? Because typically for citizenship by descent cases, you have to prove a chain of lineage between yourself, the applicant, all the way to the original ancestor of yours who was the citizen of that foreign country. You prove that chain of lineage typically through vital documents, okay, so through birth certificates or baptismal certificates. And if an ancestor has changed their name along the way, right, there's going to be sometimes a disconnect, okay? They will have been born under one name, okay, and then the next person, let's say it's that person's child, or you're presenting that birth certificate, and it lists their mother or their father as a different name. There's a disconnect there, right? And sometimes that can be addressed, more cleanly if there was a formal name change through, a court order, and you can get that documentation. But sometimes that name change was just through common usage, as I referred to before, in which case sometimes you got to provide substitute evidence to prove that that's the same person, right? So that's a real issue and consideration, right, for applying for naturalization. And if you're listening to this and you're a a freedom seeker, a mobility seeker, a person who's trying to build, second, third, fourth, maybe even fifth citizenship throughout your lifetime. If you're a long-term planner, you may actually be thinking also down the line to your own children and your grandchildren, right? And if they have to go through processes in which they have to prove your identity, right, then naturally that would play into your decision making, or it should play into your decision making about when, or if or when to actually change your name, either through, when you're naturalizing elsewhere, or even if you're not naturalizing elsewhere. Okay, so that's kind of my framework for thinking about these issues, how they arise, and why they matter. We got a strong attendance here. We got Scott here, Martin, Jeremy, Italian Stallion, Patrick, David. Okay, I'm going to kick off. So Patrick's been kind of a co-host with me on a lot of these mobility spaces. So Patrick, I'm going to kick off with a question to you, and then just as a reminder to everybody, anybody can speak. Okay, so if you want to speak, okay, if you want to chime in to agree, disagree, whatever, just send me a request and I will approve it right away. Okay, so my first question is going to be to Patrick. So Patrick's a consultant for citizenship by descent. He helps people apply for citizenship by descent. This is my general question, Patrick. Take this wherever you want. When you're dealing with a client who's interested in possibly changing a name, okay, when they're naturalizing elsewhere, what's your starting point for this, for how you advise them on how they should think about the issue? Not whether they should do it or not, but how should they frame up the issue in deciding whether to change their name or not in a second citizenship that they're getting, or third?
Great question. And I'm so glad you asked me, because I was thinking to myself, what's the best way to frame this entire conversation? And that question does it. Um, yeah, I think at the outset, there's essentially, you basically want to have the conversation as to why someone would like to change their name. And I apologize if there's noise around me. Just let me know. Um, and the questions are, why you would want to change your name. And there kind of comes down to a handful of reasons. I mean, it's a non-exhaustive list, but it generally is a common usage, or this is the name I'd like to be known as. Um, you know, uh, I, there's a Spanish version of my name, an Italian version of my name, and so if you're living in a country and you naturalize there and you want to use that as your common name and not have to go, oh, this is my legal name, this is my common name, that might be a reason. Um, the more, I guess, like secrecy minded or libertarian or freedom minded reason might be, oh, I want a different identity in this country that can't be tied to my original names in my former country. And I think there's a lot of flaws with that argument, but I'll go back to it. And then the last um, reason for name changes might be um, through marriage or family relations, right? So it's like, and I have seen this sometimes where it's like, um, you know, my dad was, my dad was adopted, or, uh, you know, done a couple cases where it's someone was born in vitro and their dad isn't their biological dad and they had a falling out. And so they want to change their hyphenated last name, or, say you're someone who has you see this a lot in public facing roles, politicians, people in news. They might want to use like their mother's maiden name because it presents their likeness better on a public stage, right? So I think that all of those foster the conversation well. Um, I would say that generally at a high level, I think it's almost always more work than one might assume. Not just because you're setting yourself up for potential issues in KYC, but because you really have to have it as part of your identity to deal with that extra work. And so, in that convenience versus security paradigm, if you're like, oh, my name is Patrick here in the United States, but I want to have it be in Irish, Pedrig, where it ends in a G, the anglicized Gaelic. Um, those two countries, not even the countries, the EU and the United States, share travel information. They share, I, you know, they share, you know, some aspects of security information and for travelers and just uh, just general security background checks. So, all it takes is one action for them to link those name changes together, and you're still left with all the KYC work, but not with the benefits of security, right? And so, to give you an example, if you're a non-US citizen and you're applying for a visa to the United States, you have to present all your passports. Well, that's a collection point, right? And so then suddenly people know you have multiple passports, and if they're in different names, you know, maybe there's a reason people might ask that. Maybe it factors into your approval or denial of your American visa. But at that point, if that information is collected there, it can then be relayed to, at some point in the future, to any of the countries that have you with one identity or the other. And so, it kind of all comes down to it. And I'll stop there, but that's how I would start the conversation. And the long-term planning and citizenship by descent really is close to my heart, and I can talk with a couple fascinating examples later on. I'll start there. I'd say that's the best I have for starting that conversation.
Yeah, thanks for that, Patrick. So when it comes to somebody trying to change their name, so first of all, let's back up for a moment. I distinguish a little bit changing name and changing identity, right? Changing name I look at as much more of a surface level thing. It's how you want to be called, okay? But the person in that case doesn't really have much of an issue with kind of being shown as having the same identity, like one unified identity across different names, right? However, other people, for different reasons, sometimes want to actually move towards changing an identity. Okay, whether it be for more nefarious purposes, right? There's one side of it, people who've maybe committed crimes in the past, or are thinking about committing crimes. But sometimes, the idea of changing the identity can also be tied just to personal reasons, right? Sometimes it could be tied to something embarrassing that happened publicly previously, right? So we have changing names, changing identities, right? And obviously, if you're trying to change your identity, that changing names is part of that. Um, because of the proliferation of biometrics taking fingerprints, okay, for identity documents and for major purposes, there's more limited utility in trying to change one's identity in the modern world, right? Whole scale, change their identity, especially for the purposes of important robust processes. Okay, immigration, professional licensing, naturalization, criminal records, right? Especially in Western countries where when you're arrested, you're also fingerprinted. It's difficult. It's much more difficult. It's still not impossible because information sharing is not complete between jurisdictions, but it's much more difficult for those major processes to try to change your identity nowadays, right, than it was 50, 60, 70 years ago, right? But one scenario that I see that comes up is the public embarrassment or public criminal case scenario, right? And if a person, so hypothetically, right, so one type of case that I deal with, and some people on the call might know this, but I help people challenge and update their FBI background checks, typically for the purposes of second citizenship. So an American citizen does something, they have some sort of criminal record, whether it's an arrest and a charge and conviction or just an arrest and a charge, and that basically mars their FBI background check. Those marks on the FBI background check make it more difficult for them, generally speaking, to get second residency and citizenship. Sometimes those people have a path to be able to challenge those background checks. I help with that. So as a result, I get to talk to different people that are in this scenario, and they want to apply for a residency or citizenship in a foreign country, and they have different motives, okay, for why they want to go there and why they want to update their background check. There is a profile of person that has either committed a crime, okay, or been accused publicly of committing a crime. And that is searchable online through a simple Google search, okay, whether it be because they were put on blast by social media or because a news channel, maybe a local newspaper or news channel covered it. But it's something, the fact that those accusations can be found publicly is a pain source for the person. Okay. On that level, a person basically, moving to another country or naturalizing in another country and effectuating the name change, right? That can actually provide relief for the person to some extent, right? At least to the extent that they're able to operate socially, right? They're able to kind of get away from, some of the transgressions that are associated with that previous name, right? That's a more superficial level, okay, of identity change. I don't say that it's valueless. It has value, but that's a superficial level, right? If you're giving fingerprints, if you gave fingerprints before for your arrest, and you're giving fingerprints, now for applying for residency or citizenship, if those jurisdictions talk to one another, that information is shareable, and you're easily going to be identified as the same person, right? So I look at identity change, right, as kind of being, I kind of look at it as two levels, right? One is the more fundamental one, which is very difficult to get away with because of the proliferation of biometrics, and the second is the more surface level one, right? You can still kind of change your identity to the extent that people can perceive you, socially, in social settings. We're not talking about an immigration officer or a police officer or on that type of level, right? So that's kind of one thing that I explain to people when they want to, when they're discussed, when they're thinking about, whether it makes sense to try to change their name or not. Now, one other type of case that I deal with is U.S. naturalization, right? Among others, right? When people naturalize in the United States, you can change your name, right? I think most people know that. Most of my clients don't want to change their name, but some percentage of them are at least curious about it, and they ask me about it, right? I think it's a hassle. Okay, I think what happens when you change your name, in order, especially if you're somebody who's travels a lot and wants to get second or third citizenship, or if you have identity documents in 2 or 3 countries, I think it creates disconnects that are burdensome, that are hasslesome for the person. Okay. Is it worth it? Well, obviously, the only way a person could know whether it's worth it is by determining, how compelling the reason is, for them to want to change it on the other side. But I generally don't like name changes unless there's a compelling reason for it, right? So that's kind of what how I explain the situation to my clients. Okay, cool. Okay, so yeah, so let's open this up for discussion. I think when people, if you write the phrase changing your legal identity, I think the first thing, probably like the first thing that comes to people's mind is kind of nefarious reasons, like James Bond, or trying to be a spy, or like, hiding your identity, things like that. There, in doing that, but less so, and obviously in many cases that obviously can be illegal, right? But for getting away from the first identity, name changes can be, can obviously be
I,
solid, right? Go ahead.
yeah, I have something. So I'm curious to hear the feedback from the practitioners about instances where when you take on a new nationality or citizenship, uh, you're compelled by that country to take on a different name. For example, if a person were to naturalize as a citizen of Vietnam, I think that the current practice is that Vietnam requires that person to take on a Vietnamese name. Or if a person is to naturalize in a place where naming conventions are different, for example, in most of Latin America, they use last names of both parents. Um, if you go from using one last name typically under your original nationality, and then you naturalize in such a place, your new identity in that new country might involve two last names or a totally different name. I'm curious, what are the practical effects and I guess the downsides of having to manage multiple uh, official names?
Great question. So it's a disconnect in the documents, right? You have to prove your name and your identity when you do a variety of different things in life, whether it be from, applying for a visa to, getting your signature notarized, for example. That's something I have to do a lot, right? And my clients have to do a lot for their cases. When you go to a notary to get your signature notarized, right? Some notaries are going to be sticklers about the type of, ID that you, or the name, excuse me, the name on the ID that you present, right? So if you present, for example, in your example, Scott, if you present to a notary an ID that has two names. Okay, the name of your last name of your mother and the last name of your father. Okay, but you're tasked with signing a document. Okay, that is related to just one name. Let's say you just use your name, the name of your father, right? That's gonna raise some problems for you. Okay, maybe the notary might not let you sign the document. Okay, or they might not notarize that you're the same person because there's an extra name on there, the name, the last name of your mother. So to me, that from what I've seen and what I believe, it's the disconnect in the documents that can create friction in doing things in your life, right? Especially if you're doing something that's under time pressure. If you have to get a signature notarized for a process that has a deadline, right? And it's going to be difficult for you to basically have that wrap around. So that's one thing. I don't know to what extent people are thinking about their grandchildren trying to, do things related to their own name, but doing citizenship by descent applications, when we have messy naming conventions or names of the ancestors, that, like I said at the beginning, and I don't know if you were here, Scott, that causes more work, that causes more problems, right? Oftentimes they're surmountable, but it's just obviously, more of an issue. So that's what I think about, first and foremost. Okay, the extra friction that's created by disconnecting the documents. What do you think, Patrick, or any other practitioner that's here, or anybody who's dealt with this?
I had one of those famous New York sirens going by me. Yes, I have actually a lot of practical experience with some of this. Let me explain it at a high level and then give you some really esoteric examples that hopefully hits it home. So the short answer is that, and this is a broad generalization, but most of those documents that force you to take on a new naming convention are generally more valuable in the location that issues that document than outside. So, a US passport, for example, is great because English is the, medium of exchange language throughout Europe and a good chunk of the world. But that might not be true for or for names in an alphabet that's not, a Western alphabet. So a lot of Asian languages, the Cyrillic language. A phenomenal example is a lot of Greek documents are issued only in Greek, and it's not like Greek has a lot of common alphabet characters with other languages. So it makes it, all of the EU documents have English on them, but for having a name in that language, it may be, for example, my name's Patrick. If there is no equivalent of Patrick in Greek, they're going to get the closest that they can with that and put it in that language and put it in the respective language, right? And so if you use that document elsewhere in a language other than that, you're going to have to get it translated. And that translation will likely just translate that closest in that language to, in this case, Patrick. Um, now, let me give you a couple examples to kind of hit that home. So if you are someone with a citizenship by descent, citizenship, then in most cases, you have the right to get your birth certificate issued in the country of your citizenship by descent because you're a citizen from birth. And in that case, let's say, for example, Ireland's a bad example because all of the documents are in English and Irish for the few speakers. But say, for example, for Italian citizenship by descent, you can get an Italian birth certificate, even though you may have been born in the United States. If you have Italian citizenship by descent, if you use that Italian birth certificate anywhere that doesn't speak Italian, you're going to have to get it translated. And, Patrick in Italian is Patrizia with a Z. They're going to translate that to Patrick if the clearing language is English. If it is in a different language, let's say it's being translated to a Cyrillic language, they're going to get as close as they can to Patrick in the Cyrillic language. And it just makes things it's tough to do quickly. It makes things really difficult in the short run. Um, I have worked with a few clients where they're very global people, and they've had, they are, they are eligible for citizenship by descent, but they've lived for a decade, say in China or Korea, with a Korean partner. And so their child who has an Asian birth certificate, an English name, or in some cases a European name, getting that squared away from a document procedure so that that birth certificate can be used in a European country is incredibly challenging. And if you add on to that your stereotypes of bureaucracy and bureaucracy between different countries in this example in East Asia, it makes the entire process a multiple month process. And you could never use that birth certificate in the United States to say notarize a document because, well, A, it's not a photo ID, but second of all, there's no way to read it, right? And so I think all of these, there's ways to prove it. It just requires multiple documents, and the translation is probably going to be that key that allows you to have a different language name translated or repurposed for a new identity reason or a new mobility reason. And very last, I'll leave it here on the Latin American with four names. I do think they treat that a little bit similarly to the way Americans treat middle names. Um, if you ever fill out a government form, it says a middle name is optional or middle initial is optional most often because not everyone has a middle name. A middle name, again, doesn't exist across cultures. And so Latin Americans treat that second last name or the maternal last name, the maternal surname, as optional. If they're operating in a space where, you're someone who's naturalizing or you or if they're a person who's going abroad and it only asks them for one last name, they default to the um, paternal surname because, of course, their kids would not have the grandmother maternal name. It would be the wife's maternal. It would be the wife's last name. So, there's a similar effect as the way we treat middle names here in the United States.
Yeah, great points. And one of the things, Scott, so when you get documents, especially vital documents, translated, officially translated, typically you can work, at least the translators I work with, the certified translators, typically you're asked by them or you have the opportunity by them to basically say what the preferred spelling should be in English if the document is being translated from an alphabet that's other than the Latin alphabet. So if it's coming from, Russian, the Cyrillic alphabet, or Persian or Arabic, the Perso-Arabic alphabet, right? Those names aren't going to have a clear-cut one-to-one translation into English. There's going to be a variety of different ways that the name can be spelled. Parviz, for example, right? Parviz is the more common one, but you can also spell it in English Parveez, so ee instead of I, right? So for those, with those documents, as a practical matter, when they're being translated into English, right? We want to be careful, not be careful, but we instruct the certified translator to translate them into the Latin alphabet with the convention, with the spelling that either matches up with the other person's documents, or if the other person, if they don't have any other documents in this name, matches up with how they want the name to be spelled in English, right? And this is just all, this is all in an effort to just try to reduce friction for people to basically go through their lives in processes in which they have to prove their legal identity, right? One thing that I've learned, as a practitioner, and then also I learn increasingly as I, deal with more background check issues as well as my Palau digital residency experiments, is I no longer look at a person's identity as a centralized thing. I actually look at it as quite decentralized, right? You have most people, and even somebody who's out there thinks, no, I have only one name with one spelling. I've had it my entire life. I guarantee you, if we dug deep enough, even on that one example, we'd find somewhere where for some process, their name was either different or had a slightly different spelling, right? Is that second name part of their identity? Is that a decentralized part of their identity? I would argue, the way I look at it is that if they use that different name, or at least that different spelling, even if it was slightly different, functionally, okay, and effectively to do something else, and they actually got the thing, were able to accomplish the second thing that they wanted to do, then I would argue that that actually is a part of their identity. Okay, they use that identity legally, and were able to, attain whatever it was that they needed to prove their identity for. So I look at identity just the same way I look at background checks and criminal records, as more decentralized than I think people typically think that they are. And obviously that holds doubly and triply true if you're a person that has citizenship in multiple countries and identity documents in multiple countries. All right, so okay, background checks. Let's talk about background checks for a moment, because this comes up a lot. And background check issues kind of accrue the more citizenships you get, right, when you're applying for another citizenship or residency, right? So if you, I'll take as a starting point an American that has become, if you're applying for second citizenship, typically you have to, show background check from your country of citizenship, as well as oftentimes any countries that you've resided in. Okay. Now, fast forward, let's say that same American was applying for second citizenship. Let's say they were 23 years old. Fast forward, let's say they're 40 years old and they lived a globally mobile life, okay, planning for maximum freedom, sovereignty, plan B options. And let's say in those 17 years, they've picked up 2 more citizenships and they've been resident in 2 other countries. Okay, so let's say now they have 3 citizenships in total, and they've been resident in 2 additional countries, and now they're applying for citizenship again. Okay, well, not always, but typically, countries that are taking naturalization applications want background checks from all the countries of citizenship, and sometimes countries of residency of the applicant. Okay, from the past. This is where name changes, right, can really, name change issues can really multiply and amplify, right? Because the person has to apply for a background check from all of those countries. Okay, let's call it every country of citizenship and residency that they had. Okay, and for some of those background checks, they cannot actually get some of those countries, they cannot actually get the background check without providing ID. And some of those jurisdictions are going to provide friction to the person that's trying to request a background check with one name. Okay, when the records that they have, if they have any of the records of the person, is under a different name. Okay, so that's another issue to consider for name changes. And I would say, part of the calculus for a person deciding whether they want to change a name, okay, whether they're going to, is to think of how many more countries do they think in the world. I mean, are they really somebody that they're trying to race towards 5 citizenships and multiple residency permits, or is it just a one-time deal? They're picking up a second citizenship or a third citizenship, and they don't, they realize they may apply for another, country citizenship in the future, but it's not something that's really in their plans. If they're thinking about having a lot more, citizenship and residency applications in the future, that might be a factor against changing the name, right? Because of the multiplication of issues that can arise. Whereas if they're, if it's a one-time deal to apply for a second citizenship, okay, well then maybe it's not that big of a deal. Maybe it's less of a deal for them to to request a name change. Okay, so I think that's also an important component as well. Okay, we got Alex here, adding Alex as a speaker. Reminder to anybody who wants to speak is welcome to come up. Let us know what your experiences are. Let us know what you think. If you have any questions, if you disagree, do you disagree with anything that somebody's said? Feel free to speak, anybody.
Yeah, hello there. Hi, this is Scott, calling in from Greece at the moment. I've just got a question for the practitioners. It just strikes me, would you ever consider advising somebody to change their name on a second passport or a second citizenship, application, on the basis of historical animosity between the new country and your own country of ethnicity? Say, I'm thinking perhaps of Turkey as one example, which is, obviously that's a very popular CBI at the moment, and it's had its share of wars and enemies in the past. I'm just wondering if do you think that would be advisable to change your name to a Turkish name or a non confrontational name if you had one? Thank you.
This is a great question, Scott. I'm so happy you asked that because that was something I wanted to talk about. And that goes to this concept that I call nationality toggling, okay, which goes hand in hand with identity toggling, right? Nationality toggling, the concept basically is that when you're citizen of multiple countries, right, you can kind of choose a little bit how to present yourself when you're dealing with third countries, right? So a few considerations. So first of all, when you're talking about passports, unfortunately, most passports still list your country of birth, right? Even if it's a different country. So that can kind of limit, to the extent you're trying to get away from a certain national identity that you're associated with, your ability to do so, at least with the passport as an identity document, is going to be a little bit limited, right? Because of the country of birth. Now, your question is actually kind of a little bit personal to me as well. My name is Parviz Malakouti. I'm Iranian and I'm American, right? And I think probably everybody knows, the history of the countries, at least in the last 45 years. I've never felt a compulsion or to get away from Iranian identity. That's a personal consideration, right? And this is where I think the answer is quite subjective. Some people are very sensitive to feeling like they're being targeted or discriminated against, based off of whatever other ethnicity or nationality that they have. I don't feel that way, and I think I'm kind of anesthetized to that to some extent. But that's a personal consideration, obviously. Now, Scott, as far as changing your name on documents, you know, changing your name in a second country of citizenship for documents that are not a passport, okay, let's say they're more superficial level. Yeah, I think that could be an effective, that could be effective as a tactic to try to get away from a certain identity, right? If you change your, let's say you naturalize in the second country, okay, they issue you a passport. That passport still has your original country's of birth, right, which is the identity you're trying to get away from. But then let's say you go and get a driver license in that second country or a national ID card, okay, with that new name. Okay. Well, that typically is, ID, a driver's license is not going to have the giveaway, okay, which is your country of birth, right, on it. So, for processes for which you would use your ID and not your passport or certificate of naturalization, yeah, I think that could be an effective, tactic to try to get away from whatever other, identity it is that you have. Is it worth it? Well, obviously it depends on, how much you value trying to get away from that. Because you're obviously going to give up something in the way of hassle in terms of changing the names, as we talked about earlier in the live. Patrick, what do you think? Any other practitioners? Anybody else like to weigh in on the question? Great question, Scott.
Yeah, hi guys. Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Italian.
Yeah, hi. I just want to add something to those citizenships when you are getting a citizenship second one. A lot of countries in Latin America are not stating your birth country. So when you're getting citizenship in Latin America, a lot of them lately, for example, Uruguay just changed the law, and when you're getting the Uruguayan citizenship, there's no birth country where you're coming from, so you can basically disconnect from your original country of birth. So you got the separate identity. So I think in those terms, it's kind of really important to think about the second citizenship, where you want to have it, because like you mentioned, there are countries that they are not allowing it and still stating the birth country, which is true. And I think in those kind of like sovereignty plans, people thinking about the mobility, global mobility, we have to think about what countries we want to be second citizens of, because like having a birth country in a second citizenship mentioned in the passport is pretty limiting. So that's, I would say, it's not a good deal in those terms. And second thing is, I just going back to the not legal identity change but name change, and a lot of CBIs in Caribbean for example, they are not allowing at all the name change. So they're in, I would say, like 4 out of 5 those countries are not allowing a name change, even though you are becoming a CBI, like a citizenship by investment there. And there is one country that's allowing just a name change due to the marriage. But also those CBIs are having quite a lot of limits in those name changes. So in those terms, it might be more reasonable to look for countries where you have to naturalize. I know you have to spend time in the country, have a boots on the ground, live in the country, show ties to the country, and etc., etc. But it's, generally speaking, it's getting much more value than CBIs.
Great points. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll add a couple historical notes in here. Yeah, the name change is very interesting. You brought up Turkey, so I would imagine there's like a ton of examples where you would want to, have a potentially a different name in a different country. If you're Armenian and you're in Turkey, or vice versa, Azerbaijani, Armenian, same thing. Uh, a little tidbit from history in my own family tree. I have distant relatives far away in Canada, and they have a Protestant last name because, despite them being Catholic, they wanted having a Catholic last name. They wanted to fit in with their local community, so they changed it. So I think it kind of speaks to what you are actually like, what you are actually going to be doing, the lifestyle that you're living. If you are someone who is born in a country that might have a poor relation um, with the country that you are now living in, and it's such to the extent that you think that it could potentially impact the way you're treated or your physical safety, then I could see that the headaches of changing a name might be worth it because you are committed to a life there. Other than that, if you are spending a couple years there and you don't think the threat to your well-being is very high, or the inconvenience to you is very high because of the identifiers on your ID as to where you're born or your ethnicity, then I think you just kind of deal with that in the short run, because then your life may not necessarily be there afterwards. You're only there for a few years. So I think it really goes to speak to how committed you are to this new lifestyle in this country that has historically had poor relations with your former country, or the country in which you were born. So I think that's the conversation to have, and I suspect that it's more often than not, it still doesn't make sense to change your name.
Another thing to consider might be the costs in the future. So I think the cost of changing your name is probably going up. In the past, I have family members who were not married and they just changed their name. When they applied for their driver's license, they just put their spouse's name on it because they were basically common law married now, and they didn't bother to get legally married to legally change their name. They just changed their name, and there was no real consequences or negative detriments. I think as we get into an era of increasing surveillance and biometrics and stuff like that, you're likely to break the system in ways that I know people in China, they had really long names and their bank cards and stuff couldn't have their full name on it because it was too long. The default Chinese name is much shorter, so the system was just not designed for very long names. And I can see that happening where some biometric or other system, it's just not programmed to deal with this edge case if someone has two names and same fingerprints. And so you get a denial of some sort or some other kind of error. So I think that's something to consider as well, is that the cost for changing your name may grow over time, especially if it's for non-traditional reasons like marriage.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The cost goes up. So, I think you said it was your grandparents, Alex. What they did in just using a new name and not actually filing for any type of petition for name change, it's called a common usage name change, or a common law name change. That's still the law in most of the United States, England, a lot of common law countries. But the choke point comes, at the point when people start actually applying for documentation, and they want that documentation to show the new name, right? And they can still do it. You can still do it through common usage name change, but you may have to sue for it. You may have to file a lawsuit, okay, which is costly, right? It's costly whether you do it yourself, at least in time and hassle, and it's obviously costly if you hire an attorney, right? And there's no doubt, especially definitely in the United States and in many other countries as well, that over the last 20 years, especially since 9/11, I remember 9/11 was kind of a threshold. Before 9/11, it was a little bit more loosey-goosey in terms of, changing your names on documents just by writing something different in the application, and there not being much trouble. Okay, if the names, the name on the application that you wrote didn't match exactly with the name on the ID that you're presenting to prove your identity for that application. But that has tightened up post 9/11, and it continues to tighten up. Okay, so common law, or common usage name change is still the law. It still exists. But I love the way you phrased it, Alex. It's becoming more expensive. It is more expensive, okay? Because if the agency, whether it be, passport or, whatever agency it is that's withholding the document that you want because of the conflict in the names, if you want to force them to recognize the new name, then you might have to have a case, a court case, basically over it, which is obviously costly.
Yeah, I can actually give you guys a great historical supply chain of name changes. For those who don't know, when many people came and immigrated to the United States during the kind of the golden age of European migration, which was the first half of the 20th century, there's this old wives' tale that says that the person at Ellis Island was changing people's names, which is not true. Those names are verified by people who came over on the boats, but a lot of times people left a land that was, where there was no economic opportunity, particularly after World War One, just decimated, and they were so happy to have the opportunity to be an American. The idea that you could become someone else was incredibly powerful after you leave your life of non-economic opportunity. And so people changed their names during naturalization. Those documents can be 120 years old today, but if you want to use those documents to claim citizenship by descent, you have to justify the name change, whether or not the citizenship by descent process requires you demonstrate naturalization of an ancestor. It is a name change document. So if the name changed, you have to use it. And many times people anglicize their first name. So, Giuseppe became Joseph, right? This is very common. And sometimes today people are like, okay, that's a record that's 100 years old. But over the last decade, those name changes have gotten caught, and people say, no, we can't verify that this is the same person, even though all the other things are correct, right? The birth date, the location, the ancillary family members are all the same. They're like, we can't verify this is the same person. And so they require you to go back essentially and have to correct the name change, which, on state vital documents in most states can be done, some, not all of them. On a federal archival document, you can't change that name. It's impossible. You have to go and change all the others, right? And people were a lot more cavalier with their names, particularly common usage names. And so you'll see them use like Freddie instead of Fred, or, I've seen a lot of documents where they'll list the nickname of their spouse because that's what they called them by, as opposed to their formal name. And so suddenly you're like, well, on this naturalization record, it doesn't match up with the marriage record. And so it creates, and these can be 2-3 generations removed. And so it really has the potential to create a lot of problems. And even though at the time they legally changed it through naturalization or they changed it through common usage, even that, because the stakes were so low to change your name back then, even 100 years later, those costs have just compounded again and again and again. And if you're sitting there stuck trying to change the name of your ancestor who passed away in 1958 in the state of New York, you're going to have to, most people default to getting a lawyer. You can do it without a lawyer, but it takes you 3, 4, 5 months. And that's an absolute pain, and it does actually change the record in perpetuity with an attached affidavit. So um, it is quite a bit of work if you're thinking multi-generationally.
Yeah, I had a colleague, a lawyer colleague, refer a lady to me who she was elderly and she was born in California. She moved to Canada, ended up changing her name over 30 years ago, and she needed to get her birth certificate for a residency requirement, excuse me, residency application that she was applying for. Typically in California, the low friction way of getting your birth certificate is to go order it online through a website called Vital Check, right? The online system. When she came to the end of the Vital Check form, she was not able to proceed because her current name didn't match with the name on the birth certificate that she was trying to request. Okay, so she wasn't able to move forward. Now, this didn't end up being too big of a deal, but it was just added work and friction. Okay, because she couldn't go through Vital Check, she had to basically request by paper. Okay, through to the county. Okay, to the relevant county, right? And even the paper actually insisted on the names matching up perfectly. Okay, so we had to call the office, talk to somebody, explain the issue, get specific instructions from them, okay, and then basically write a little note on there for the birth certificate application to go specifically to the person in the office that we spoke to make sure that she knew, that we had spoken to her, and obviously that we recognize that the names don't match, and here's the reason, etc. It ended up working out, but what we're talking about here is we're not talking about impossibility. We're talking about friction and added cost, right? Especially for people that are kind of in this, the group that we're talking about, which is people that are really, multiple citizenship, global mobility minded, right? A lot of people that show up for these spaces, either they're dual or triple citizens already, and they want to go for more citizenships and more residencies, or they want to pick up their second and third and fourth citizenship. And I mean, the upshot is the more citizenship and residency processes you're looking at doing in the future, either for yourself or for your children, the more the issue of a name change is going to be compounded. Still doesn't mean it's not worth it. It just has to be, the cost has to be accounted for properly in making the decision.
One thing that's somewhat related is it's sometimes possible to change your kid's name, or at least give them a name at birth that's different than your own. So if one had a name that they think is disadvantageous in a given territory or territories, they could, for example, if they want to anglicize their last name, they could just give their kid the anglicized last name instead of changing their name themselves. And if they do it from birth, then it should be easier for most things. Even nowadays, proving you're a parent usually doesn't require any paperwork. Usually, if you just assert in a hospital or someplace else that you're the parent or spouse, I've never seen anyone ask for paperwork in my experience. So that's something that people may consider, is perhaps another solution for people who are concerned about the family integrating could be to just change the next generation's name.
Alex, you took the words out of my mouth. I was just about to bring up the fact that the evidentiary standards for paternity at the hospital are oftentimes tiny or nil, not existent whatsoever. And I think that's a big shock for a lot of people who either haven't become a parent yet, or maybe they weren't paying attention when they became a parent. But that's absolutely the case. And in fact, I mean, just as a funny side note, inside baseball, I don't want to mention the country publicly, but for at least one country that I know of, and actually possibly two, that lack of evidentiary standard of the father in the hospital has actually made it more difficult for a person to prove lineage through the father for the country's citizenship by descent, because they know in this particular country, okay, there is no standard to be able to assert, that you're the father at the hospital. So yeah, that's an interesting point and kind of a hole, right? That's, we're talking about this kind of buttoned up, very tightly knit, integrating system of nation states to try to pin you down on your identity and your relation to other people. And it's kind of like this big gaping hole, right? That's right there, which is that in tons of jurisdictions, you could just show up there and say you're the father and put the name down, right? And that has real downstream legal effects. So I guess that's something interesting to watch over the coming years and decades. Whether jurisdictions start kind of buttoning that up more.
Well, I wasn't even talking about paternity. I'm saying that usually, well, it depends. I think in many Anglo countries, you can pick the name for your kid, including the last name. You don't have to give them the surname of the parent.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm taking this even a step further. You oftentimes don't even have to prove the identity of the father to be written on the birth certificate.
Well, if
Yeah,
you really
actually,
want to go far, you can actually have multiple parents on birth certificates now, more than two in many jurisdictions. I've seen as many as four that have a form for that you can fill out parent one, two, three, four when creating the birth certificate.
I'll be very interested to hear the mobility spaces 30 years from now dealing with the downstream consequences of that.
so I actually have a few anecdotes here in support of that, kind of to flesh it out, um, which is a shame because I was going to make a polycule joke here, but um, the I had a client come to me who late in life he discovered that his legal grandfather, who he barely knew, so there's not a lot of emotional fallout, which is great, who he barely knew was not actually his biological grandfather. And it was one of the cases where 100 years ago, you know, to put it in real blunt terms, if someone was shooting blanks, they went to someone else in the township, for family creation. And he learned this a couple of years ago. And his question was, can I use the biological grandfather for citizenship by descent? Which is a very expensive question because the paperwork involved in that would be ridiculous. It would require a DNA test, a very expensive and thoughtful um, lawyer in the country. And in the country that this was for, they don't really look super kindly onto those sorts of dynamics. Um, and so it reminded me that when you brought that up, that you could put four parents on a birth certificate, it's a way to get around a situation like that. Or if your birth certificate is reissued, but you know who your biological parents were, and then you were adopted later in life. And when for most cases, when someone's adopted, they get a reissued birth certificate with their new legal parents' names on it. If they know their biological parents and those parents were, there's no that information is not legally bound up, then a birth certificate with four people on it suddenly creates a lot less friction in your life for proving both biological and legal things that you are entitled to. And um, I'll leave it because we were talking a little bit about this multi-generational aspect. I'll also throw this out there, and that is on a death certificate, which is a little macabre, but everyone does estate planning. They should plan for this too. If you have multiple names in your life, particularly if you've naturalized somewhere or you're coming from a place with a non-Western alphabet and you decided to pick an American name, on your death certificate, it has to have your legal name on it, but there's usually I believe in all states, if not most of them, there's a section that says there's like an AKA or it doesn't say nickname because it's too colloquial, but there's a wild card field that you can put in another name. I've advised a few people who've had to, who's had a parent pass away, um, where they say, "Hey, my parent is from this country. They've gone through they've gone through a legal name change and a common usage name change, and it's like put all of those names that are not his legal name, put all of them there, because for you, anytime later in life, as the descendants of this person, you're not going to have to deal with all of this madness of all of these name changes because it's all encapsulated onto one document. And that way, 2 or 3 generations down the line, you don't have to deal with a posthumous name change, which is a nightmare. So we're talking about the beginning of life and the basis for you know someone being born to a polycule with a bunch of names, but there is a use for it. And on the other end, it's true when you leave this world. Make sure you have it in your will or your next of kin. Hey, just go ham so that this certificate covers all of my bases as to who I was in this lifetime.
Yeah, that's a great point. Obviously, a bit of thoughtfulness in a very sensitive time can really help you avoid costly processes down the line, UN and future generations. Yeah, that's a great tip on the death certificate.
Has biometrics been discussed already?
Yeah, we did discuss to some extent, Alex. Basically, we discussed how the proliferation of biometrics makes trying to wholesale change your identity for robust processes much more limited, much more difficult, obviously, especially to the extent that jurisdictions share information with one another. Basically, what I said, Alex, is the way I look at identity change and the relationship with biometrics is that it's difficult to get away from a past identity for, real robust purposes, criminal records, immigration, citizenship, etc. But that for you can kind of get away from a past identity for more superficial considerations, like embarrassing things that are attached to your name that are Googleable, for example, or like what Scott mentioned before, trying to get away from a previous nationality or identity, right? So changing your name in the second country you naturalize in, and changing your name to away from your clearly ethnically identifiable name, right? So if you do that in the second country, you either get a passport that does not mention your country of birth, although unfortunately many of them do. But you typically get driver's license or national ID in that second country, and then you can use that second ID to kind of get away from the first identity. So yeah, so on a superficial level, right, you can get away from the first identity more easily, but for processes that require biometrics, it's much more difficult. But feel free to add whatever you like.
Well, I was saying maybe it could be fun to do a case study. So I could be the guinea pig. I have a fairly long name. I have two middle names, and my first name is Alexander, which is somewhat long. And I also have an ethnic last name. Now, my ethnic last name, does anyone know where it's from? It's Ugorji.
No, I mean, if I
I
had
feel like
to,
I should know this. I'm gonna
And
go
so
Hungary.
the advantage I have is that my last name is non-Anglo clearly, but nobody knows where it's actually from. I've heard Russian, I've heard Japanese, I've heard all kinds of things. Actually, it's Nigerian.
oh,
And so the my ethnic name has not really harmed me very much, if at all. I mean, sometimes you might not be aware. Maybe you applied for something and you didn't get it because they're like, "What kind of name is this?" I don't know. But generally, I don't think it's harmed me much, and it's probably helped me in many ways as well. But the thing that has harmed me is having a long last name. I mean, a long full name. So on forms, often there's not enough boxes to fill all my names in the letters, or there's confusion where, especially right now, I'm in Latin America, and they see two middle names and assume my second middle name is my first last name, because in most of Latin America, you have two last names, your father's last name and your mother's last name. And so sometimes I wonder, would it be useful to change my name to something shorter, whether it's just Alex Ugorji and cut out my two middle names, or even perhaps change my last name to something that could be advantageous both to me and towards the next generation, where I have a friend, I guess I shouldn't say the name to dox them, but they have a very prestigious sounding name for their kid, which they picked on purpose because they're like, when they're going to hire someone for the investment banking job and they see all of these fancy Anglo names that are very regal sounding, they're going to say, oh, yeah, this person is probably very competent. And so they purposefully selected names like that. Although my last name is, I don't think a big harm, something more regal might be useful in some circumstances. And so I wonder what you guys would advise your hypothetical client with this information, or at least questions to think through with them?
Yeah, it's an interesting issue. I do tend to think that, regal sounding Anglo names kind of, whether people admit it or not, I think it does have an effect on a lot of people. But here's the thing. I think the big advantage of unusual ethnic names is that in 2025, in our day and age, everybody's a personal brand now, right? People have different personal brands. And, to a large extent, the value of your personal brand is how identifiable it is, meaning you being you and your name. So I think in that respect, unique names are kind of an advantage, right? If somebody, for example, let's say somebody's somebody's heard you, Alex, talking about free cities, for example, right? Um, you know, it's going to be hard to confuse you because of your name with somebody else that was talking about free cities. Let's say they heard something, they liked it, they want to look you up later. Okay. Right. It's not a David Smith or, I hope I don't offend anybody here. It's not something that's super, super common. So I think there is actually some branding value from having unusual names from that perspective. I see it as a double-edged sword. What?
Yeah, I think like it depends really, because like maybe depends what's your case scenario, but sometimes you want to be really like a James Smith. You know what I mean? Like you don't want to have a like name that everybody remembers. Depends on your business and what kind of business you're doing. But being like a like a gray man, it's kind of super helpful in your day-to-day life, especially if you're dealing in a business where you don't want to be really like a recognized, and you don't want to be targeted from the OPSEC perspective. So also the like a generic name is pretty kind of useful, and I believe like everybody's using it. If you're getting like a packages from Amazon, I don't believe that anybody's using a real name. Everybody's using like a James Smith, and you get it like into like a PO box delivered, and nobody knows your address where you live in. You're just basically protecting your own privacy because you don't want to deal with leaking your like residential address. You don't want to deal with leaking your real name because like the thing is that all those systems these days, it's just a question of time when all the databases are going to leak, and it's not just if but when. And less information you are spreading about yourself, it's just better for your privacy and privacy of your family. And I also think that it's kind of like you know with that, not a legal identity, because like you mentioned, Parvis, it's kind of complicated honestly. But let's say with a name change, it might be worth it. Like if you are like high net worth individual, if you might if you're targeted, you might be targeted with some organized gangs because they want to exploit you. They want to exploit your family, um to pay a ransom, whatever. So, have another identity in terms of at least like a different legal name with a different citizenship. It might be better to just like disappear and play the game, which is like more complicated for your, counterparty. So I think it's not that just kind of simple to say if it's worth it or doesn't worth it, because obviously it's got a lot of complications in terms of banking, and like you said, traveling to different countries, and some countries are sharing all those biometric informations. So it's not a silver bullet, but I think it might worth it for certain individuals to keep the privacy a little bit higher than normies.
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, the gray man, right? This comes down to obviously preferences and vulnerabilities. So yeah, that's a great point. If you are a wealthy person, right, and you're in a jurisdiction that targets wealthy people, I don't know, let's call it Brazil, for example, for kidnapping, then yeah, whatever value you get from trying to, from being more of a gray man might outweigh whatever you get in terms of, identifiability or branding, right? based off of where you're at in life. So yeah, that's a great point. And then yeah, for packages and obviously for information, for identity that you don't want to share. Yeah, absolutely. You know, the more vague, the more common, the more gray man, the better, right? You know, and obviously on the flip side, you know, for identity you do want to share, you know, I don't know, let's call it content creation or your blog or your YouTube channel or whatever, then maybe you want the more unique name. So yeah, I totally agree, Italian. I think it's quite profile and preference specific, right? You know, whether you know what type of name you go for, you know.
Yeah, look, I agree that, but if you want to run a YouTube channel, or if you want to run a kind of like a, whatever marketing business, you need to market yourself. I think you can do it with nickname or whatever it is. You don't even have to use a legal name. It can be kind of like you mentioned, it can be a brand. It has nothing to do with your legal name and your residencies and all your like family matters. uh, Nobody needs to know about it. The question is like what to do, or what in what situation you are at, and if that makes sense to go through the hustle of a name change to have some extra, maybe like a layer of privacy in those terms. Because like creating a James Smith identity for packages, it's pretty simple, everybody can do it, and it's totally legal, and you're just receiving packages with a different name on it. But from the perspective of citizenships, it's totally different story, and I don't think it's for everybody. But again, I think there are will be more and more people around the globe, let's say especially with crypto and so on, that's going to become a really high net worth individuals in the future. They are going to get pretty wealthy, and I think that that OPSEC perspective is going to be more important than before, because it's going to be like really like a huge change and huge shift in wealth of the globe, with a lot of like OGs in that industry becoming really really wealthy. And let's put it this way, these individuals gonna have a hard time to live under their birth name. So I believe for that specific niche group, it's gonna be one of the reasons to go through that like a legal hassle to change the name and have a multiple citizenships.
Excellent. By the way, that's Italian Stallion from Plan B. He has a YouTube channel, very active YouTube channel on Plan Bs and sovereignty, privacy, OPSEC, as well as active Twitter account. And I think is it a Telegram group you have as well, Stallion? What else do you have?
No, I'm not on Telegram, because Telegram is kind of like, it's not good with privacy. It's
Okay.
shitty with privacy, so I don't use it at all. Mostly Signal groups. Signal is like end-to-end encrypted, and which is not the case for Telegram. So yeah, really dealing with privacy stuff, and trying to empower every individual with having better privacy than before. And because it's going to become more and more important, not just in a physical space but in a digital space too. um and obviously I would say my estimation right now is like a lot of people are starting to be educated in the digital aspect of life, like okay, use a good VPNs, that they are not reselling your data, and use a good privacy services. They are open source and so on. But in that physical aspect of life we are talking about right now, having like some kind of backup plans, and if like shit hits the fan, so having multiple residencies and citizenship, it's kind of the industry that people are still having a hard time to grasp that idea, and having the kind of like what to do with that. And also in hands with that goes like having 10 different, residencies across the globe or citizenship, it's also putting you in kind of difficult situation because especially with residencies, you need to keep them active and to maintain them and not to become a slave of those residencies, because then your whole life is about just maintaining all those options you have. So it's kind of like um difficult to select the right residencies, the right amount of residencies, and the right amount of citizenships to have still freedom and sovereignty, and not being a slave of maintaining all those solutions across the globe. So yeah, we can talk about that for hours.
Yeah, absolutely. The challenge is when you go on more grids in order to have access to more countries, more jurisdictions, etc. Well, more grids also has more attack vectors, more issues that can trip you up, more vulnerabilities, right? So that's basically that's what the trade-off is in order to reduce your single sovereign reliance. Go on more grids, and now deal with the potential attack vectors, red flags of additional grids. So yeah, absolutely agree with you on that point. So I just want to recap, Stallion, your position on, and tell me, please correct me if I'm getting this wrong. Your position on um, whether you change your name to, or whether you keep a name that's unique versus more generic. You don't think it has anything to do with the privacy benefits versus the branding benefits. You think the branding benefits can pretty much all be gotten by kind of a fictitious name or an alias. You think the real analysis is the privacy benefits versus the hassles that we've spoken about for the last hour, the potential hassles of changing your name, especially if you have multiple, a foot in multiple jurisdictions. Is that more or less correct, Italian?
Yeah, like I think like from the branding perspective, yeah, you can just create your own brand. And I would say majority of brands in a digital space are whatever. All the YouTube channels are just created brands, not a legal name of those individuals. From the perspective of having another legal name with another citizenship, I think that might have a benefit for certain individuals, like I said, especially high net worth individuals, even though there is a hassle to deal with that. But again, like, I mean, if you take your family, you just relocate, you live in another country, you go for another citizenship by naturalization, you live in that country for a couple of years, you show ties, the whole family can get another citizenship. Then later on, if that country allows to change the legal name, you just change your legal name, even for your spouse, for your kids, for everybody. You can have a one citizenship with a different legal name and use it for your own benefits. I'm not saying it's that simple in terms of, like, we spoke the last 1.5 hours about, like, banking system and that kind of global mobility. It can have some drawbacks, but still, yeah, from that perspective, I believe the legal name, different legal name in another country might have a lot of benefits for high net worth individuals.
Yeah, that provides kind of a segregation of that identity, a little bit of a moting of that identity, right? And yeah, that's a concept I've been exploring, researching, and thinking a lot about, because I do advocate for privacy and citizenship. Meaning, I tell people, I say on both online as well as my own clients, if you get a second, have at least one citizenship that nobody else knows about, that you're not public about. Okay. And in reality, maybe you want to even be, private, completely private about multiple citizenships. What you're saying, Italian, which I agree can have some massive benefits, is having a different name, in that other jurisdiction. It provides extra segregation of that identity, because at least on the surface level, so if your biometrics are not taken, it's not associated with the names that you have on your other, dealings, matters, citizenships, etc. Right? I'm just, I'm researching and thinking about how that could be most manageable without hamstringing the person moving forward, right? To the extent, meaning like the disconnect, basically. But I do, I'm pretty sure that I believe that there is a profile for which the benefits of doing that is going to outweigh the difficulties. I'm just trying to find out where that balance is, or where I think that balance is.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. It's like it's not that simple, and obviously I think it's also about to like find the right citizenship that is not having a that kind of like a bureaucratic problems with changing the legal name, and especially those two citizenships. You got a citizenship original one, and you got another one that you might get through naturalization, for example. So finding those two jurisdictions that they are not kind of like jeopardizing each other, and that one original citizenship is not having kind of complications and kind of challenges with your second citizenships. I also believe that you don't, in some cases, you don't even have to disclose your second citizenship to your like a former or your primary citizenship, so that those countries, they don't even have to know about like that you are holding another citizenship. So you can, like you mentioned, you can keep it secret. And um, like there is a one kind of proverb in OPSEC, and it says like loose lips sink ships, and this is exactly the case. So you shouldn't be that much vocal about your backup plans with the public and with the audience and whatever who it is. So you should keep it secret, close to the chest, not talking about it. You should have that plan set up, and it's for your own benefit. The more you talk about it, the less and less strategically like use of that second citizenship can be used, because like then you are losing your leverage.
Yeah, great point. I wrote an article about 2 years ago. It was titled, Do Americans becoming dual citizens have to inform the U.S. government?" And I'll bottom line up front, the answer is no. And I talk about in the article exactly what you just mentioned, which is countries that you're naturalizing from, okay, whether you have to actually inform them of you becoming a citizen elsewhere or not. And there are some countries that you have to inform them either before you naturalize elsewhere in order to maintain the first one, or sometimes afterwards, right? The latter example would be Spain, right? If you're a Spaniard, you naturalize elsewhere, you have to, by the letter of the law, inform the Spanish government within 3 years, right? An example of the former category, where you have to inform your country of citizenship before you naturalize elsewhere, was South Africa up until just recently. Okay, so if you were a South African citizen and you wanted to naturalize elsewhere, you first had to file with the South African government an intent to retain South African citizenship. And if you didn't do that, and you went ahead and naturalized in the other country, you were deemed by operation of law automatically to have lost your South African citizenship. So that's a super important criteria, right? Because as Italian mentioned, if you come from a country that you don't have to inform, right, you're better off not informing and just keeping the cards close to the chest. And that's it's that's something that I see. It's tough for me to kind of have an opinion on whether a lot of people do it or not a lot of people do it. I know what I see on social media, which is a lot of people that are in the space, especially people who are kind of professionals, will post up their citizenships, their passports, that type of stuff. And there's a marketing value to it. So I can understand to an extent, at least if you're a professional, I can understand, maybe they think it makes sense for them to do it. I think a person that does that is giving up a lot. If you're just somebody who's a fan or, an aficionado, you're not a practitioner that's trying to market, I do not understand. I have a hard time seeing any benefit to flossing all the citizenships and passports, or even just residencies, all of them that you've gotten on social media. If you have a lot of ties, open ties with the country, you live there, you're public about it, you talk about your business there, okay, fine. Maybe it's kind of obvious that you probably have a residency there. I can understand that. But listing all of them, or listing the residencies that you don't have a strong countervailing benefit to disclose, I just don't understand it. And I've been trying to kind of think of, am I missing something? Is there a benefit here that I'm not seeing, or is it just, a difference in opinion on OPSEC? So really appreciate that input from you, Italian Stallion. And follow-up question for you, Italian. Does it ever make sense? Can you think of a scenario where it makes sense to publicly disclose, and I mean like post it on social media, for example, all of the citizenships and residencies that you have? Can you think of a single scenario in which that makes sense? Let's try to straw man, the opposing argument here, or strong man it. Excuse me.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know. No. In my opinion, it makes zero sense. Like you mentioned, exactly. It's like I don't see any value to post it online. Like, what is the benefit? Even though you are like a practitioner, it's part of your business. Even in that case, I understand it exactly as you mentioned, but still having a really hard time to grasp that idea. Like maybe it's about like what you value more, if you value more your business, or if you value more your like family life and your own privacy. That everybody has to go through that in their own head. I'm not saying it's totally wrong. I understand that if somebody is in the business and they use it as a marketing approach to other customers, but still I hardly understand that to do it, and totally don't understand like making, taking the photos of their, ID cards or their passports, and like like bragging about like I got another citizenship, and bragging about like I got another residency. It's a total OPSEC failure. And I mean, if you do like OSINT on like interested individual, then you have something to grab this information. Your another citizenship is like whatever, Turkey. Okay, fine, I know it, that you are Austrian citizen and then you are a Turkish citizen. uh, you're getting those kind of puzzles, you can put it together. uh, a lot of other information probably from a social media, because those people, if they're disclosing their citizenships online, I believe they're probably going to disclose other information online on Instagram or Facebook, and they bought a new car and they bought a new house, and probably they are even gonna geo tag their location where they live, and so on, and maybe taking a photo of their kids, and that kind of crazy shit. I don't think there's any value, and even in that case, it's your business, you're running it as a business, you need to earn money for a living. I got it, but I don't know if it outweighs the like kind of having a calm life with your family. Maybe it's much better to have a like a private life and not having a business than having a business and later on in the future being a target of like nefarious actors that they want to exploit you or your family, or you can put it your kids in danger because like you are pretty vocal about what you're doing.
There's another really, really pernicious attack vector that I've written that I think is going to really increase. And I wrote a tweet about this. I'm currently working on an article. I'm going to do a video on it as well. And it's basically using extraterritorial application of laws of a country on their citizens against people who are open publicly with their citizenships. Okay, let me explain what I mean. So countries have their laws, obviously laws that apply when you're in the country. It's applicable to nearly everybody, possibly, in some limited cases, diplomats excluded. But one thing that people are less aware of, although they are learning more about it, is that countries can and do apply law extraterritorially on their citizens as well. Meaning, you're a citizen of, I don't know, let's call it Brazil, or let's say the United States, for example. Let's call it the United States. We have a lot of people that are from the US that listen to this. US can and does impose their laws, okay, on American citizens that are abroad, okay? So every citizenship that you pick up, in addition to the benefits, which people speak about ad nauseum, myself included, passport, visa-free access, all this stuff, it also comes with a set of obligations, okay? And the most obvious potential ones are ones that I've written about, other people have written about, 4 red flags of second citizenship: mandatory military service, citizenship-based taxation, prohibition of renunciation, etc. But there's also way more extraterritorial laws that apply on citizens. The bottom line is, if you're a public figure, okay, especially if you're a divisive figure, okay, and you tell the world all the 4 citizenships, let's call it, that you have, you signal to the whole world, including to anybody who would wish you ill or harm or want to get any leverage on you, you signal to all of them all of the 4 sets of extraterritorial obligations that are imposed on you. Okay, that's a really big issue. And I don't think it's that obvious yet for a lot of people, but especially with the rise of AI, it's super big, because now what you can do, and we've already seen this on a crude level, okay, with just some of the more divisive figures, but what you can do is basically take the person's public actions or statements or whatever, okay, and ask AI to compare it against the legal systems of which they are citizens of, okay, and come up with a list of potential crimes that they've committed, okay, and then have a package, have an evidentiary package sent to the relevant prosecutorial agencies. I think this is going to be a really big issue moving forward. And like I said, we've already seen this. We already see this actually on a crude level. It's just that because it was more costly to do this attack vector was more costly to impose. It's only been imposed kind of on the biggest, targets so far. So this is something that I think is a really big latent issue. Andrew Tate's always in the news, but he was in the news a few weeks ago because it was revealed that he picked up Vanuatu citizenship by investment. I don't know. Did you guys see this, Italian, Patrick, Alex? It was
Yeah.
It was everywhere.
you saw
Yeah.
it. So it was revealed that he picked up Vanuatuan citizenship by investment, and it took about, predictably, a third of a second for the Guardian and all these other, newspapers that hate him. And I'm not defending him, by the way. I think I do not like him at all. I'm just talking about this attack vector. It took them 2 seconds to immediately start writing articles and pressuring the Vanuatu citizenship by investment, unit. So now, obviously, they tried to put a microscope, basically, on his citizenship. You don't want a microscope on your naturalization, even if you did everything perfectly. Okay, a microscope on your legal process that you did to get a benefit is an attack vector. Okay, they put that on him. Okay, they contacted, somehow they got the name of the CBI agency that processed his application. There was an article that said that the agency was contacted and they confirmed, okay, that they processed his application. That was NXT, who's a follower of mine actually. And I tweeted, actually, after this came out, I tweeted at that account, NXT, were you really approached by a journalist and you just blurted out your client's file information? You confirmed that he was a client and that he got, if so, that's shocking. The account didn't respond. That's my tweet from 2 weeks ago. They didn't respond. Okay, but that's a whole nother side issue that we can talk about, which is confidentiality in your mobility professionals. If that entity, if that agency did that, NXT, that's a shocking failure of client confidentiality. But anyway, the point is, Tate is obviously super duper, hated by a lot of people, super controversial, but just the fact of him, of it being known, revealed somehow that he got Vanuatuan citizenship, immediately put pressure, basically. And Vanuatu, look, they're a little bit disconnected they're a little bit less sensitive to the pressures now of, the Guardian and the EU and the US, because they already was stripped of Schengen visa-free access. So I think they're a little bit more sensitive. But let's say that was Tate that had naturalized in Grenada or Dominica or St. Kitts, okay, or Malta. Oh my God. Okay, if he had somehow made it to the Malta KYC, if that story had broken and all this same pressure that was put on Vanuatu was put on any one of those programs, I think there's a good chance that they would have, those programs may have thrown him under the bus and said, tried to, go over his application with a magnifying glass and find where he, didn't disclose something or mistakenly wrote this or something like that. So the bottom line is, those are all attack vectors that present themselves, okay, first and foremost by people knowing where you're a citizen of, okay? The Tate example is much less harmful than, in my opinion, the other, scenarios that I talked about, because in his situation, okay, worst case scenario, they were trying to get him stripped of his citizenship, which sucks, don't get me wrong. But there's going to be people who are going to be public with their citizenship, and they're going to have done things publicly, especially with the attack on free speech, that's going to make them criminally liable extraterritorially in that legal system. And people are going to start attacking that way, in my opinion. Okay, so I totally agree, Italian. And you're big on talk. Obviously, OPSEC is one of your things. You're one of the big accounts, that talks about this stuff. And I think it's totally under considered generally. It's one of those areas, OPSEC, of second citizenship, privacy of second citizenship. It's one of those things that has not caught up yet. The awareness of it has not caught up yet with the gravity of the issue and the need.
Yeah, and there is also another vector that with with years to come, it's really hard to delete that information. If you leak that information, it's out there, and you can undo it. That's the hardest part at all. Like in total, like you wanna be maybe in 5, maybe in 10 years, you're gonna change your ideas and kind of like approach to everything. And if you're going to leak your second citizenships to the world, you're not going to undo it. It's impossible. It's going to stay on the internet forever. So basically all those actions you're taking right now are going to have like kind of repercussions in the future, because maybe you're going to have a family, maybe you want to disappear. But in that case, if you don't have a extra citizenship in a back pocket, which nobody knows about, then it's pretty hard to deal with that in the future. So I would say you have to think twice before you act. And yeah, definitely from where it goes everywhere, more like a jurisdiction scrutiny on everything, and being more and more detailed in what every individual does, and what is the past, and what are the connections, and so on. So less information are out there, the better for the individual. 100%.
Yeah, I think I'd push back a little bit that obviously certain things are bad for OPSEC, but the OPSEC is to help you. You don't exist to maximize OPSEC. So I think for a lot of people, they're buying second citizenships as luxury goods. And if you tell them that they can't use their luxury good, which was the whole reason they bought it, was to flex and say, oh, look what I bought. You bought some car that's going to depreciate. I bought this passport that's going to appreciate. So I think it depends on the person and the risk profile a lot. For many people, they're not doing anything interesting. And so for them to take away the fun doesn't make sense.
Yeah, Alex. I mean, from an Austrian economic perspective of subjective value, if the person's buying that and they truly value the ability to flex more than all of these drawbacks, then they should flex, right? That's what they value the most, and they should do so. Okay, so I definitely would agree with that. I think the bigger point is most people just don't know. They're not aware of what they're giving up by the flex. They think they're giving up nothing, or maybe something that's trifling. So, my attitude, and I don't want to speak for Italian, he can speak for himself, but my attitude is, as long as they're well informed of the deal they're making, okay, what are you giving up? Okay, if you're gonna flex, yeah, you love flexing, yeah, okay, that's worth 200,000, 300,000, okay, fine. As long as they're aware of what they're giving up, okay, but by all means, they're an autonomous individual. They should do that. Then, I just think the vast majority of people who do that, who flex their passports, don't actually know what the potential downside is.
Yeah, I think that's a
Yeah.
good point, Larry.
I think we had two people trying to speak at once. Italian, you go first, and then I'll hear Alex. I couldn't hear what Alex said. Go ahead, Italian.
Yeah, like my perspective on that is that everybody can do whatever they want. I really don't care. It's their life. It's their decision. If they want to flex within another citizenship, nice. Yeah, good for you. I'm happy for you. I'm just thinking that it's not kind of smart to do it. If you want to flex, you can buy a Lamborghini, put it on an LLC, and you can flex with that Lamborghini that is owned by LLC, and everybody's going to be happy in like Ocean Drive, and you're going to be driving the new Lamborghini there, and it's going to be cheaper even though than buying a San Kitts and Nevis. But if they want to do it, like, no problem with me. I'm just trying to look into that from a, like a sovereignty perspective. If we want to be a sovereign individuals, so we should be thinking about it, like what kind of like repercussions in the future it might be and do. It might like how it can influence us. And I don't think it's like kind of net positive for us if we are going to be flexing with not citizenships. That's it.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think it's just someone not thinking about it and being expedient, because you can say, oh, I am marketing myself or my services or even a lifestyle, but you can do all of those things without explicitly listing your citizenships, right? I think the only steel man that I can think of that would work here is if you were one of like the 5 people in the world who navigated some extremely obscure and esoteric citizenship process, and you want to market the fact that you're like one of the few people that have navigated this successfully. That's the only scenario I can think of where the marketing value might be worth more than uh, giving up that information. But I think it's just someone wanting to market, and not even market explicit services, more market a lifestyle, which again, you don't need to list your citizenships to market that. I do genealogical research. I've operated in at least 12 different citizenship by descent programs. Doesn't mean that I have those 12 citizenships. And even if I did, I wouldn't need to list them to market services, right? So um, I think that's I don't know. I think it's just careless and expedient.
Cool. All right. So it's 12:48 Pacific Standard Time. We've been going for about an hour and 45 minutes. Really good conversation so far. Typically, these spaces last between 1 to 2 hours. Most of the time, it's actually an hour and a half to 2 hours. So before I wrap up and basically just pitch the topics, potential topics for the next spaces, is there anything else, any other subtopic that we want to cover, or does anybody want to add anything?
Actually, yeah, I'll add, not necessarily for the next spaces or even next week or two from now, but uh, with Stallion on, it would be great to do like an episode on like the tactical approach to, say, immigration and passport control, and just like best practices, because we're talking about like biometric collection, which sometimes happens unknowingly at immigration and passport control, or how you protect multiple citizenships if you're going through like an e-reader at the airport. Like maybe there's an episode where we do like a tactical OPSEC approach to mobility and identity when you're transiting through ports of entry.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just going to jump in here. That was exactly so how to cross borders safely and privately. That's one of the top topics that I want to have for one of our next few spaces. And yeah, obviously Italian. I think Italian would be wonderful for that. If but he's got limited time. He's got a lot of shows, limited time. But yeah, we definitely want to have a spaces on that. If Italian can join, then we definitely would accommodate. But not sure how your schedule is, Italian.
Yeah, like that's interesting topic. Obviously, I like that one. Yeah, like next Tuesday, I guess we can do it again. I can make my time for next Tuesday. Next Tuesday is pretty good for me.
So yeah, I can do Tuesday, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, the same time, if that works for you.
Yeah, I'm cool with that. Yeah, happy to talk about the topic. No problem.
Patrick, does that work for you too?
Next Tuesday? Yeah, roger that.
Okay. And we have Gay Primate who just joined. Anything you wanted to add, Gay Primate, before we pitch the next spaces? Okay. I don't. Go ahead, Tuesdays. So we're gonna have number 14 on Thursday, 2 days from now. We'll have number 15 next Tuesday, co-hosted by Mr. Italian Stallion and of course Patrick as well. But for the next topic, okay, so do we have any, Patrick, do you have any topics that you would like us to talk about for the next one, okay, which is Thursday, 2 days from now? Or do you want me to just go back to the list and basically mention the few that we had there? The list is over 30 long, okay, but I'm just going to pick the top 4 that I wanted to consider for the next mobility space. So number 1, consular assistance as a benefit of multiple citizenship. How beneficial is it? Number 2, should you build genuine links with your second citizenship? Okay. Number 3, the red flags of a second citizenship. And number 3 is a topic that comes up constantly in our spaces. We've spoken about it, in nearly every space, but we could have a space entirely dedicated to that one. And then number 4, this is a hot one, passport rankings, why I, meaning me, Parviz Malakouti, think they're mostly BS. So these are the 4 subtopics that I'm considering, or I would consider for the next space. What do you guys think? And Italian, even if you can't show up, feel free to express your vote.
Man, I like all of those, honestly, but I agree with you about that kind of free visa entrance is total BS. I agree with you on that one. That's a great topic. Those red flags are also amazing topic. And those consular services I like. So D3 are my kind of, I really like to talk about them. So, but yeah, others can say their own opinions. I'm not so sure if I can make it on Thursday. Maybe yes, but I'm not so sure.
Okay, appreciate your input. Patrick?
I think since it's towards the end of the week, I think the passport rankings might be a fun one. Of the others, I think the consular benefits or consular access is very tactical and potentially thoughtful. And I don't know if, the average person doesn't have a deep opportunity to fully explore that personally. And so having a conversation about it would probably be pretty informative.
All right, so Patrick's vote is for passport rankings and consular assistance as a benefit. Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with Patrick on it would be fun on Friday to do rankings, and then also consular. I've not thought a lot about, but seems something that would affect a huge amount of dual and more citizens. So, and I haven't heard too much discussion of that either. So both of those are interesting to me as well.
Okay, it's going to be Thursday, by the way, July 3rd. The Friday is July 4th. Okay, and here's a thought. For the consular assistance as a benefit of multiple citizenship, I was thinking when I wrote that as one of the topics we do that I would like to have on Radha Sterling of Detained in Dubai. She's an advocate that's gotten countless people out of detention, not just in Dubai, but all over the Middle East, largely leveraging the consular services of their country of citizenship. So I think it would probably be too short notice to set this for Thursday and then reach out to right away and say, hey, can you come in? So I think that might be a reason to possibly delay a little bit on consular assistance. David, any preference? I think passport rankings. I think it's time. I gotta let it out. I got a lot of vitriol for these fake ass rankings. Pardon my French. And I want to lay out my opinion and rationale for why I think literally 95% of them are BS. And I want to hear pushback if anybody thinks, oh no, they're legitimate. Okay, so that's going to be the topic. Okay, so Thursday, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, mobility space number 14, passport rankings, and why I think, and this is just me, okay, anybody who has a different view, okay, is welcome to come, and you're going to be welcome to express your viewpoint, and we're going to try to steelman the opposite view as well too. Okay, we just want to have a conversation and get to the truth to the extent possible. Okay, okay, so that's it. Thank you everybody for showing up. Alex, appreciate it. Patrick, as always, thank you for being a great co-host. And Italian, this is your first appearance on the discussion. Thank you. You had a lot of great input, and I hope you can make it on future spaces. And of course, I got to appear on your show as well, at some point. So we'll definitely be in touch about that. Thank you, everybody. Have a great one.
Thank you.